All right, so the sabbatical that I went on, that you guys sent us on, very thankful for it, first of all. Secondly, I'm anticipating the good fruit of this from the research and the time to think and to gather my thoughts. So initially, I was going out to look at the way our language changes as we grow in our relationship with God, specifically in prayer. Um, the example that I can give is kind of like the example, the example of one of the kids coming into our home and the relational connectedness that happens, and then the impact it has on language. So, for a quick rundown, a kiddo enters into our home, and I am a dad, right? I'm a dad amongst a whole bunch of slew of others. Over time, then I become the dad of this house, and continue on and move forward. I become their dad or my dad. It also translates pretty well, actually, into a relationship with God, especially revolving around the stages of discipleship that we've been doing over the last 7 years or so. And that would be, I believe in a God. So that would be that movement kind of from stage one of stranger to Jesus to, or acorn to sprout. So then there would be that shift to the God of the Bible, right? So that would be an embrace of the one true God, not just a God among many, but the God. Finally, moving into that last movement of my God. So what I was going about and trying to research is, what is that movement between a to the to my, um, and in prayer life, then that shift as well, not just praying to a God but praying to the God, but not just praying to the God but praying to my God. And what I found was, I believe, anyways, from what I researched, that movement is actually intimacy. Each of those pieces and each of those movements is the growth of intimacy between us and God specifically, and also then us here, and even in this video chat. Um, and I was really interested in it as well through the Korean connection that I had after high school doing the missions work in Korea. And in the Korean language, there's actually basic three levels of what they call politeness. Um, there's the um, there's the formal level, which is the highest level, and then there's the standard level, and then there's what they call informal or intimate level. And the way that you know how to use each of these grammatical levels is actually based on your relationship with the other person. So if you have a relationship with your boss, you would normally then do um, the high politeness level, the formal politeness level. If you're with a coworker, you're probably doing standard. And if you're with a coworker who's your family or who is a really good friend, then you would do the informal or the intimate level of Korean. And I thought this was really just a fascinating look at the connection of language and relationships. So when I started out looking at this relationship that we have with God, the first article that I read is on the chat, and that is from the Desiring God website, and it's a great website, a great resource to have. And it's the title is How to Have Intimacy with God. And so the author there really does a good job of hitting those highlight pieces of an intimate relationship with God. But I don't think we just arrive there either. So what is those pieces that connect or connect and fuel what intimacy is, and how do we move those, how do we move forward in that? So those were some of the questions that I began asking as I was doing some research into this. And that would explain then that second article in there. And that is, it's a very interesting article. It's a secular writer who is trying to wrestle with the what he notes as the crisis of intimacy in an age of digital connectivity. And we are in full experience of that right now. And to be honest, when we came back and we had that one Sunday, I was like, oh, this is great. All of this great learning that I've done about intimacy, I'm going to start applying and start working on. And then no, right? It was just no. And for almost a week and a half, I was living in this nightmare of what I agree with the author is a crisis of intimacy, in which we think that what we're doing right now is actually connectivity. And while it is what we have to work with in this particular environment, it is not true connectivity and true intimacy, because there's breakdowns in it. And I think as we begin to, as I begin to unpack this and begin to look more and more at what God has been teaching me through this, is that I still agree with that. But the change for me over the last couple weeks is that this isn't necessarily, this can't be a time in which we focus on relationships horizontally with one another, but focusing on our relationships vertically. So how do we grow in our intimacy with God, and not and not and not focus on the horizontal, because the horizontal is not, well, I don't want to say it's not possible. It's just the medium doesn't allow for real, true connectivity. Video does not do it. And I even experienced that this morning. This morning was the hardest morning of preaching virtually, because my family was not feeling terribly great. So they had to stay home. So there was actually no one in the sanctuary, no one, up until 9:25. And then Dwayne and Brenda showed up, and I was relieved. I could feel the anxiety building, in which I was going to have to just preach to a camera, and there's really no connectivity there at all. And so that raised then a whole bunch of more questions, right? And that is, no, I'm sorry, Brian wasn't there. He was worshiping with his family at home, because we switched the way that we were filming, switched the way that we did the live version of it. And so I used my iPad, and so I really just had to press the button, and Brian could then worship with his family, which I don't think he hasn't done yet, because he's been over here. So, and I think Jana appreciates it, right? Yeah, you don't see too much of him traveling around, right? Right. So, but then the question arises then out of this, right? Is, okay, so if we have to be physically present with each other in order to engage in intimacy, how in the world then do we do it with a God who we can't see, taste, and touch, right? That's and here's part of the mystery of intimacy as well, that we have to acknowledge right at the beginning. And that is, one of the first things that I learned was that intimacy is a mystery, and we have to hold that in it. We just have to hold that mystery in it, because I can't explain it. I just perhaps I don't know. So it's a mystery, but we're going to continue to unveil and unravel and poke at that mystery a little bit. And so the couple things that we base things that I want to address as well, right? And that is that while we all here in the call this evening agree that there is a God that truly exists, we believe that. For those that when you engage with this as a video recording, I may not. I'm predicating all of the other aspects of this study, that not only is intimacy possible, but it is possible with a living God who truly exists. And not only does he truly exist, and not only is he living, but he wants to have a intimate, deep, meaningful relationship with his creation, with the image bearers of him, and that is us as humans. And so we need to start there. I need to start there, along with the next base piece of that, and that is that the relationship that we have and that we have in our life do not reach a level of completion in our current life. There is too much sin and brokenness that doesn't permit then for that. And so no matter where you are in this journey with God and with one another, we are moving ever forward. And so this is a good time for me to connect it then to discipleship. And so the connection between intimacy and discipleship, I would say, is the thing that moves us from stage to stage, is how we refer to it, or how I've been referring to it, to at least give us some language about what it means to grow and to mature in our faith. It's not just a matter of time, but it is a matter of doing and being in a relationship with God and with one another. So taking those two things as building stones then, and recognizing what Jesus said in Matthew 24, verses 36 through 38, where he tells, where he's talking and they ask him, what is the greatest commandment? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the other is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what does it mean then to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Well, I think that that love and intimacy is so closely connected that it is inseparable. And so when I'm talking about intimacy, I'm talking about that love relationship that we have with Jesus, with our Lord and Savior, with our God. That we can't break those pieces apart, or I simply could not. So to love God, Jesus says we must do it to the all degree. And I know, Catherine, I've been really working hard, Catherine, in evaporating and limiting my degree forms, but to the nth degree, I think, is the terminology in math, right?
Can I clarify? I told him that I think it's weird when he says that thing, to greater and greater degrees.
Right.
Like, nobody says that.
I do.
But he can't come up with something else to say, so y'all can help.
I'm working really hard at it.
I know what he means.
So how does it look, and what is it like to love God to the nth degree, or to greater and greater degrees throughout life? So there it is. I'm using it because I haven't come up with a better terminology. And when we talk about growth, then we also talk about movement, right? So we were in one place and now we're in a different place. We also use that same kind of um, um, proximity language when we talk about relationships, even if physically we're not in the same room. So we talk about being close with my family who's in Massachusetts, right? So how are you then close? Well, it's these pieces of intimacy that are built into these relationships that are continuing to build upon one another to create an environment rich that allows for the relationship to grow and flourish and to move from one area to the next. It's not unlike then being able to move through the levels of Korean, right? So moving from the formal level, this is the very polite level, in which you use with your elders and those who are in authority over you. One Korean instructor put it this way: if the individual who you are talking to can change your life, then you should use the formal politeness level. Moving then to the standard politeness level, in which we are engaging on maybe not necessarily an equal standing as far as authority or as far as or as age, but operating on an equal level, more equal level as to relationships, in which we can both meet each other together, and then that intimate level in which um, we shed those and I'm going to use this isn't really connected with the Korean language, so please don't misinterpret this, but shed those facade pieces that don't allow for real connection, but help promote a form of tiered submission. So
You mean
trying to,
authenticity?
I'm sorry.
Do you mean authenticity, like being authentic?
So I think authenticity has a certain connection to that as well. Yes. So certainly being authentic in it, and that is also one of those Bible verses in which Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians 13, and this is a great text also to gauge that movement of relationship with God. And so he writes, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And so Paul is using that natural human movement from childhood to adulthood to compare the movement of a disciple with Jesus and their spiritual understanding. He goes on to say, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Which I'm going to bring to, which now brings us to the first piece of what I call the vehicle of intimacy, and that is knowing. So Paul is saying, we're looking to go from putting away childish things to becoming mature adult in our faith, and we're going to continue to do this, but we're also recognizing that we see in a mirror dimly, but when I am fully known, I shall know fully. So this knowledge piece of it is vital to the intimacy of a relationship. You can't have an intimate relationship with someone who you don't know. I'm going to use a movie reference here for my illustration, and that is Frozen. And they do this so well in the first movie, in which Anna is swept off her feet by Prince Charming, right? So if you've seen it, Great. If you haven't, you should definitely watch it. And so she comes after having a night of dancing and running around the palace with this guy, comes to her sister Elsa and says, "We're going to get married. It's not going to be a big thing, but don't worry. You know, we can live in the palace." And she's like, "You don't know him, right? You have no idea who he is. You have no idea what his history is or his story. You simply have not had time enough to get enough information about who he is to have any bearing on whether or not you love him." So knowledge and intimacy are deeply connected. But at the beginning of this, and during the intro, I said, you know, we live in an age of a crisis on intimacy, like the article title said. And the writer goes through and says, you know, we live in an unprecedented age in which we are throwing up all sorts of information about who we are. And a lot of it used to be, until the social media craze happened, so, you know, 15 years ago, that information used to be intimate information, like where you went to on vacation, or um, or what books you're reading, or what your political views are, or what your religious views are, or what you did on just the average day. Those pieces were intimate information that you would share with those that you cared about and who cared about you. Now we just kind of vomit it out into social media. And the more information that we are getting, the more we are realizing that intimacy isn't just knowledge. It can't be, because otherwise we would have intimate relationships all over the place, because people know everything about us, or at least a lot, and especially pieces of information that, you know, would be considered intimate information. But that's not the case. You know, there are people who I've connected with on Facebook who I don't have a relationship with at all, but they know what I post up there. And I'm not very good at posting, so I guess I'm not really one of those individuals who shares terribly a lot of information on there. But but I hope that that illustration is helpful, because I think that um, we get we get stuck on knowledge being intimacy, and it's not. There's something more than just receiving information, although that is vital to the movement of intimacy and the movement of that relationship through maturity. But I don't think that it is the only thing. Um, and so I think Brene Brown actually hits on a good piece of that portion of why knowledge just isn't enough. And she writes a lot on vulnerability. If you haven't seen her TED Talk on shame and vulnerability, I highly recommend you check that out. That's Brene Brown. One of the books that I read then on sabbatical was her Daring Greatly book. And she describes how vulnerability enables a real authenticity of that sharing of knowledge, and an openness in which we demonstrate courage and strength as we lay ourselves open and before people. And a lot of times in maybe American culture specifically, we view that as weakness, when it does take a great amount of strength and courage to undertake an opening up of our lives and sharing it with the individual, which requires information, right? You can't have an openness about who you are if you're not bringing out and showing information. So I was talking with one of my pastor mentors in through seminary, Mike Laird. He's pastoring New England Chapel and doing a church plant out there, and we were chatting about this topic, and as we were talking about it, he's like, oh, maybe um, vulnerability then is the car in which we're headed towards intimacy. And that analogy started to ring a little bit truer. And so I would say, knowledge would be kind of the steering wheel. So if we don't have a firm grasp of direction and a good sense of boundaries, we're going to get into a lot of trouble if we're not steering our vehicle correctly. And I would say vulnerability is that vehicle in which we can demonstrate those pieces of what it means to connect with God. And when I was thinking about this, when Paul says, for we see in a mirror dimly, but we will know fully as we are fully known. Our movement in this relationship with God, I would say, is one-sided. Darren, are you putting up time signs? I couldn't read it.
I was just proving to Katie that I was taking notes.
Oh, oh, good.
Sorry.
Yes, yeah, okay, so good. I'm glad you're taking notes. So then we have this piece of not knowing fully, but being fully known, and that is that one-sidedness. So we're serving a God who knows everything, and there is no asterisk to that. The only asterisk is from our perspective. We don't know everything, and we don't know everything about God. He knows us inside and out, and he knows our entire lifespan. He's not asking us to share with him because he needs information. He's asking us to share with him because there is that vulnerability piece that is required in that movement of intimacy with him. It is a demonstration that we are going to be trusting him with this very precious information. Not that he doesn't already have it, but it is the act of giving that I think is the propelling piece of what it means to grow in and grow up in this relationship with God, in this disciple relationship, in this movement from when I was like a child to when I became a human or an adult. And we're talking about that movement of growing then to love God with all of our being, our heart and our soul and our mind and our strength. And so if we want to break it down into that particular text, knowledge is, loving God with all of our mind. And so being able to give him the information, not because he needs the information, but because we need to give it. And so our relationship with God then is based in a healthy environment in which God doesn't just accept everything that we tell him, because he can't, right? He also has to be just. And so here's where another piece of risk happens. And that piece of risk is when we are vulnerable and when we have made ourselves known, we also are declaring our failings and our faults. And the risk comes then with the rejection of the other individual or the judgment of the other individual. So the way that God has created a healthy environment in which we can move in intimacy with him is that he has given us the grace of forgiveness and justification through what we are celebrating during this season of Easter, and that is the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So it is a monumental movement and takes great courage and strength, which has to then be provided, I think, from the Holy Spirit to move us into that place in which we can come before the throne with confidence, as Hebrews tells us that we can, because we are experiencing the grace that God gives us in our daily life, which helps us to move in those degrees and in those pieces of sharing and displaying and showing ourselves to him. And practicing then that vulnerability through the sharing of the knowledge of who we are. That means that if we take our car analogy, or if I take my car analogy, and we got, I think, knowledge as the steering wheel, the vehicle as vulnerability, then as Mike Laird said, we would put trust as the tires. Those are the things that hit the ground and move us forward. If we don't trust God, then we're not going to be able to express and share the knowledge of the internal workings of ourselves, because we will always expect then the absolute worst in return. So I would say that that this rings true also in our relationships horizontally with one another. If we aren't in a relationship now that we have trust in, it doesn't move forward. We hit a moment in that relationship where we risked something and it was returned to us as we had feared, and so it halts or it stunts the growth of that relationship, because we can't then move on into that deeper part of relationship because our trust is broken. The wheels are flat. It doesn't mean that that relationship is kaput. It does, though, mean that we have to walk into those relationships recognizing the need for trust and recognizing that it is our decision to give it or not, and to wrestle with the question, how much do I risk? Those three questions we do horizontally. We don't have to do them vertically, but I think we do. Because sometimes when we open ourselves up and we trust God, it sometimes feels like we get rejected. And so we have to also be careful that our emotions aren't dictating to us our responses, but we do have to be aware of them. And so moving through that, I think, is a vital piece of it. And I think part of that vitality comes in recognizing that, you know what? God's will is the best will for my life, but sometimes it's disappointing. And I think Jesus illustrates this. He illustrates it in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking God to take this, to take the cup from him, God says no 3 times. That's probably pretty disappointing. I think Jesus probably experienced some disappointment with his disciples, especially Judas, who betrayed him. There's some disappointment in there. It's not surprise. Disappointment doesn't have to be surprise. It just isn't what we had expected or what we had aimed for. So when we're dealing with our relationship with God, it is not that God has somehow breaking trust with us. It's how we respond to him in the light of knowing that his will is perfect and growing in our ability to say throughout our life, into your hands, Father, I commit my spirit. So I think that those pieces then afford us the healthy environment in which the intimate relationship with God continues and shapes and molds and grows us as we move forward in that. We have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to take a break there. I am though going to give you some four stuff of why I think we have a couple more opportunities to do this discussion. And so I started listing out all the things that I thought were connected to intimacy. And so tonight we did vulnerability and knowledge. And really vulnerability I connected with, we did vulnerability, knowledge, and trust. I also think intimacy is connected to experiences, shared experiences. I think intimacy is connected to action. So there is action that has to happen within the relationship. It's not simply, it's not sedentary. I think intimacy is also connected to desire. And so that one was interesting and it's worth talking about. Intimacy is also connected to, I think, value, what we value, who we value, why we value it. Intimacy is connected to distance. So we're talking about distance physically, and I would say we're talking about distance emotionally, distance mentally, right? Because you can go somewhere. One of my sons does. He mentally goes somewhere, and it is very distant. You've seen it on their faces, right? Yeah, you have some kids that do that. All right, good. Right? So we can do distance emotionally. We can do distance mentally. We can do distance physically. We can do distance emotionally, physically, mentally. We can do distance spiritually. There have been many times in my life in which I have felt very distant from God. And the psalmists also echo that same kind of feeling of being distant spiritually. So I think intimacy is also connected to awe and fear. I think that value and that awe and fear are going to go hand in hand. I think intimacy is connected to mutuality. So both parties coming together. I think intimacy has a deep connection with boundaries, those things that are set. And I also think that intimacy is connected to gratitude, gratitude-fueled joy. And so those are the things that over the course of the sabbatical that I began to think about and to start connecting what I was reading with that piece.